The familiar scent of old paper and brewing chamomile tea was usually a comforting embrace for Eleanor Vance. It was the fragrance of her childhood, of quiet evenings spent sketching by the window in their old Victorian home. Sunlight filtered through the delicate lace curtains, cast a soft, forgiving glow across the worn wooden floors of the parlor. This morning, however, the light felt thin, almost brittle. A subtle, unfamiliar chill had crept into the air, a presence that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms prickle despite the warmth from the kitchen. For weeks, Eleanor had watched her father, Arthur, with a growing sense of unease. His usual cheerful hum had faded into a quiet, almost inaudible sigh. His once bright eyes, the same hazel as her own, now seemed permanently dimmed, shadowed by an invisible burden. He would spend hours staring into the middle distance, his hands, usually so steady and capable, often trembling slightly as he held his teacup. The small, kind smile that was once a constant on his face now appeared only in brief, strained flashes, quickly replaced by a profound weariness. Eleanor's own heart, usually buoyant with the joy of her artistic pursuits, had begun to beat with a quiet, persistent anxiety. She would often pause, charcoal stick suspended over her sketchbook, the imagined landscapes and vibrant portraits within feeling increasingly fragile, as if they too might dissolve into the encroaching shadow. This morning the silence was particularly heavy. Arthur sat at the kitchen table, a single mug of tea growing cold before him, untouched. His posture, usually upright and proud despite his years, was slumped, his shoulders bowed under an unseen weight. His hands were clasped together, white-knuckled, on the chipped ceramic surface. Eleanor noticed the tremor first, a faint vibration that ran through the table, echoing the disquiet in her own soul. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot, a premonition of something terrible. This was not the usual financial worry, the minor setbacks her father sometimes mentioned with a sigh and a promise to work harder. This felt different, deeper, like the silence before a cataclysm. She carefully placed her own cup down, the soft clink echoing too loudly in the strained stillness. "Father," she began, her voice a soft question, trying to coax an answer from the oppressive quiet. "Is everything truly all right?" Her breath held, waiting for him to offer a reassuring platitude, to wave away her concern with a gentle smile. Instead, he flinched, as if startled awake from a waking nightmare. Slowly, painfully, he raised his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were not just shadowed now. They were clouded with a deep, consuming weariness, a raw, unshed pain that made her own eyes sting in sympathy. He swallowed hard, a dry, grating sound that seemed to tear at his throat. "Eleanor," he managed, his voice barely a whisper, raw with unshed tears and an emotion that felt suspiciously like shame. "There's something I need to tell you." Her blood ran cold. The comfortable scent of her morning tea now felt cloying, suffocating. She pulled out a chair opposite him, the wood scraping faintly on the floorboards, and sat down. Her sketchbook, usually her constant companion, filled with the promise of future creations, lay forgotten on the counter. All her artistic dreams, the vibrant colors and imagined landscapes, felt suddenly distant, irrelevant, as if they belonged to another lifetime. Arthur pushed a stack of papers across the table. They were crisp, official-looking documents, bound with a stark, unforgiving red ribbon. The elegant, almost aggressive font of the letterhead seemed to leer at her. Thorn Industries. The name was instantly recognizable, a pervasive presence in their city. Power, money, and whispers of a darker, untouchable influence. Everyone knew the Thorn family. They owned the gleaming towers downtown, the shipping yards, the luxury hotels, and they owned secrets. Eleanor picked up the top sheet, her fingers brushing against the cold, impersonal paper. Her eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the words: debts, loans, repayment schedules, and numbers, astronomical numbers that swam before her eyes, figures so vast, so utterly impossible for their modest life, that they seemed to mock the very idea of ever being paid. The amount was stated plainly: 7 figures, a sum that could buy their entire neighborhood twice over. "What is this, Father?" Her voice was thin, fragile, barely recognizable as her own, a mere thread against the looming reality. The once comforting tea aroma in the house now felt like a heavy blanket, stealing the air from her lungs. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound torn from the deepest parts of his soul. It's, it's everything, Eleanor. His gaze fell to the table, unable to meet hers, his shame a palpable weight in the room. I made some incredibly poor investments years ago, thinking I could secure our future, give you a better life. I took out a loan, a very large one, from the Thorne family. He paused, his voice cracking, thick with self-reproach. I thought I could manage it. I truly believed I could turn things around. But then things went bad, worse than bad, and the interest, it just kept growing, like a monster, feeding on us. Eleanor felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, wrapping around her heart with icy tendrils. The Thorne family was not known for their patience or their mercy. They were a law unto themselves, operating in the shadows as much as in the gleaming towers of finance. They built empires, and they crushed those who stood in their way, or those who simply owed them. "How much, Father?" she asked again, her voice barely audible, a whisper against the roar of her growing fear. He finally looked up, his eyes brimming with tears, a single, glistening path tracking down his weathered cheek. "Too much, darling. Far too much. It's, it's impossible to pay back now. They own everything we have. The house, my business, every last thing." His voice was choked, ragged with despair. "And they want their money, now or else." The weight of his words pressed down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. This quiet, familiar home, her sanctuary, her birthplace, was no longer truly theirs. It belonged to the Thorne family. The thought was like a physical blow, a sudden, brutal shattering of her world. The life she had known, the simple joys of painting, reading, and spending evenings with her father felt like a precious, vanishing dream, dissolving into the looming nightmare. Arthur reached across the table, his hand trembling uncontrollably as he covered hers. His touch, usually so steady and reassuring, now felt fragile, desperate, cold. "I tried, Eleanor, I truly did," he whispered, his voice thick with shame and a profound, agonizing guilt. "I begged for more time. I offered everything I had left. My pride, my meager savings." He pulled his hand back, his gaze distant, haunted by memories too painful to articulate. "I even went to them, to Blackwood Manor, to meet Victoria Thorne." The name hung in the air, a cold, sharp sound that seemed to slice through the already heavy atmosphere. Victoria Thorne, the matriarch, a woman of immense, terrifying power, spoken of in hushed tones across the city's elite circles. Eleanor knew the stories, the chilling rumors, a will of iron, a heart of ice, the kind of person who could make empires rise and fall with a single word, whose reach extended further than anyone dared to imagine. The thought of her gentle, kind father reduced to begging before such a woman sent a violent shiver through Eleanor's entire body. The warmth she usually felt for him was replaced by a surge of protective fury, quickly doused by a tidal wave of fear. "She listened," Arthur continued, his voice barely a breath, fragile as spun glass. "She listened to my pleas, my apologies. She watched me, Eleanor, with eyes like chips of blue ice, and then she gave me an ultimatum." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if steeling himself against a truly agonizing memory, a scene he wished he could erase from his mind. "She said there was one way to clear the debt, to save everything, to save me, to save our name from ruin." Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp pang of pure, unadulterated terror. Her mind raced, trying to grasp what such an ultimatum could possibly entail. More money? Impossible. A lifetime of indentured servitude? She could not bear to imagine her father broken, working for such people, his spirit crushed. The air grew heavy with unspoken dread, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. Her fingers locked around the mug of cold tea, the ceramic feeling like ice against her skin, the only thing keeping her grounded. She knew if she let go, she would shatter into a million pieces. Arthur opened his eyes, and the raw anguish she see there twisted her gut, a pain so profound it stole her voice. "She wants you, Eleanor," he said, his voice barely audible, a ragged whisper torn from the deepest reaches of his soul. "She wants you to marry her son, Julian Thorne." The world tilted violently. The familiar kitchen, the comforting scent of tea, the soft, brittle light, all dissolved into a swirling, dizzying vortex of disbelief and horror. Marry her to Julian Thorne, a man she had never met, the son of the terrifying Victoria Thorne, the ruthless matriarch of a shadowy empire. The idea was so utterly surreal, so monstrous, so profoundly unjust, that it felt like a cruel, elaborate joke. Her mind refused to process it. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a suddenly much too small cage, desperate to escape. "No," she said, the word a gasp, a desperate, visceral denial ripped from her very core. It couldn't be true. This had to be a nightmare, a terrible hallucination brought on by exhaustion and worry. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing it all away, praying for morning to come and for this dark dream to vanish. But the tremor in her father's hand, the profound despair in his voice, were horribly, irrevocably real. "She was very clear," Arthur went on, his words tumbling out, laced with self-loathing and a desperate plea for understanding. "The debt is wiped clean. My life is safe. Our name is cleared. In exchange for your hand. In marriage." He looked at her then, his eyes brimming with a pleading, desperate sorrow that mirrored her own. "Eleanor, I am so truly sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I never thought—" His voice trailed off, lost in a choked sob. The initial shock gave way to a cold, burning anger, a fury that tasted metallic and bitter in her mouth. Not at her father, not really, but at the monstrous injustice of it all. At Victoria Thorne, who could wield human lives like chess pieces, manipulating fates with such casual cruelty. At the faceless, cruel system that allowed such unchecked power to exist. Her peaceful life, her quiet dreams of art and freedom, her very identity were being ripped away, sacrificed by a woman she had never even seen, for a man she had never known. The thought of being bound to a stranger, a thorn, for the rest of her life, was suffocating. It felt like a death sentence. Eleanor pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly, the sound jarring and violent in the suddenly oppressive silence. She stood, her body trembling, a tremor that started in her core and radiated outwards, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a desperate, frantic defiance. "Father, no. This is impossible," she insisted, her voice rising, barely controlled, cracking with raw emotion. "There has to be another way. We can sell the house, every possession. I can get another 10 jobs. We can work together. We can pay it back slowly, piece by painstaking piece." Her mind raced, conjuring impossible scenarios, desperate alternatives. Arthur shook his head, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on some distant, terrible point. "You don't understand, darling. The debt is too vast. Their terms are too strict. They don't want money they can't have. They want influence. They want a connection to our family name, however small and insignificant we might seem to them. And they want control." He ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair, his posture utterly defeated, his spirit visibly broken. Victoria Thorne made it very clear. Her word is absolute. There are no other options. Not for us, not anymore. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, a sudden dizziness that made the room sway. Control, that was the word that chilled her to the bone, colder than any winter wind. They didn't want her for love or even for wealth. They wanted her as a pawn, a tool, a symbol of their dominance. Her heart pounded, a frantic, desperate rhythm in her chest, echoing the frantic beat of her inner voice screaming for escape. She looked around their small, familiar kitchen, at the chipped tiles she had known since childhood, the worn wooden cabinets, the faint, comforting scent of cinnamon from her morning toast. This home, this life, this entire world she had built for herself was all she knew, all she cherished, and it was being held hostage. "What about Julian Thorne?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning resentment for this unseen man. "What kind of man is he? You've never even mentioned him. Is he like her?" Arthur flinched again, a visible shudder passing through him, and avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the pattern of the tablecloth. I, I don't know much, Eleanor. He was not present at the meeting. Victoria spoke for him, for the family. She said he is capable, strong. He handles much of the family's legitimate business dealings. His words were evasive, laced with an unspoken dread, and Eleanor knew instinctively there was more he wasn't saying, more he couldn't bring himself to utter. The Thorne family's legitimate business was merely a thin, transparent veil over their darker, more brutal operations. Their empire built on fear and coercion. Her mind conjured images of a shadowy figure, cold and ruthless, perhaps even more so than his mother. The thought of being tied to such a man, forever for the rest of her life, sent a fresh wave of blinding panic through her. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes stinging with the pressure of unshed tears. The tears came then, hot and stinging, blurring her vision, a torrent of grief and terror. She wiped them away furiously, fiercely, unwilling to give in to the despair, to show weakness. "You can't let them do this, Father," she pleaded, her voice cracking, breaking under the immense emotional strain. "You can't sacrifice me like this. What about my life, my dreams, my future?" She gestured vaguely toward her sketchbook, lying innocently on the counter, its pages filled with the vibrant potential of her own artistic spirit, a silent, desperate plea for the future she was about to lose, a future that was being snatched away before it could even begin. The delicate features of her face crumpled with agony, a reflection of the utter devastation in her soul. Arthur finally looked at her, his own tears streaming freely now, his face a mask of profound sorrow and self-loathing. "What choice do I have, Eleanor?" His voice was raw, broken, stripped bare of any pretense of strength. "They threatened me. They threatened everything. They said if I didn't agree, they would take what was left, dismantle my business, ruin our name entirely, and ensure I disappeared." His words hung in the air, heavy with the implied violence of the Thorne family, the silent, chilling promise of consequences that went beyond mere financial ruin. "I saw no other way to protect you, to protect us, to protect this home, the only home you have ever known." He reached for her hand again, his touch fragile, desperate, seeking some small comfort, some forgiveness. "Forgive me, my darling. Forgive your foolish, weak father." She pulled her hand away, not out of anger, but from a profound shock, a numb disbelief that had settled deep in her bones. Her father, the man who had always been her protector, her steady rock, her unwavering champion, was now utterly broken, his spirit shattered, offering her up as a sacrifice on the altar of his own mistakes. The warmth of their home felt cold, yin, the air thick with the scent of his despair, a bitter metallic tang that seemed to catch in her throat. Eleanor walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet, tree-lined street that had always felt so safe, so unchanging. Now it seemed to mock her, a false sense of security that was about to be shattered beyond repair. The sunlight, once a comforting presence, now felt harsh, exposing the brutal, undeniable truth of her situation. She could see Mrs. Henderson tending her rose bushes next door, a picture of tranquil normalcy, a life that continued, oblivious to the seismic shift happening in the Vance household. That normalcy, that quiet freedom, was no longer hers. It was being stolen, piece by agonizing piece. She turned back to her father, who sat slumped at the table, his head in his hands, silent sobs shaking his entire frame. The sight of him so utterly defeated, so utterly broken, pierced her heart with an unbearable agony. She knew then that his words were not an exaggeration, not a plea for sympathy. The Thorne family was not merely a powerful business entity. They were a force, a storm, a brutal, unstoppable tide, and she was caught directly in its path, with no escape. Her mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, a loophole, a hidden door, anything that could offer a glimmer of hope. But there was nothing, only the cold, stark reality of Victoria Thorne's demand. Her peaceful life, the quiet rhythm of her days, the freedom to pursue her art, to simply be herself, all were gone, replaced by a terrifying, unknown future, a gilded cage designed by a cruel hand. The room felt small, suffocating, closing in on her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening with an unbearable pressure. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest, a silent, internal roar of defiance and terror, but the screams were trapped within her, unheard, unheeded. She was 22 years old, and her life, as she knew it, as she had dreamed it, was irrevocably, horribly over. She looked back at the table, drawn by an invisible force. Arthur had left a small, dark business card beside the stack of devastating documents. It was thick, almost black, with a subtle embossed texture that felt cold and foreign beneath her trembling fingers. In stark, silver lettering, the name Thorn Industries stood out, cold and precise, a symbol of their immense, suffocating power. Beneath it, in a slightly smaller, equally sharp font, was a single chilling name, Julian Thorn. Eleanor picked up the card, the edges sharp, almost cutting into her fingertips. The silver letters gleamed under the soft, unforgiving light, catching her eye, pulling her into their orbit. She traced the name, her mind numb, her heart aching with a profound, desolate sorrow. Julian Thorn, her future husband, a stranger, a pawn in a game of power and debt. The name burned into her mind, a brand on her consciousness, marking her, owning her. She stood there, the small card in her hand, the quiet of the house now feeling oppressive, heavy with the weight of her impending, terrifying fate. Her peaceful life was truly completely over. The silence in the Vance home felt like a physical weight, pressing down on Eleanor. It had settled in after her father's confession, a thick, suffocating blanket that muffled every sound except the frantic pulse in her ears. The Thorn business card still lay on the worn oak table, its stark black lettering a constant mocking presence. Eleanor picked it up, tracing the name Julian Thorn with a trembling finger. The slick surface cooled beneath her touch. She knew her peaceful life was over, but a stubborn flicker of hope refused to die. She had to find another way. There had to be some other path, some hidden door that could spare her this unthinkable fate. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of desperate ideas and fleeting possibilities. She thought of calling old friends of her father, distant relatives, anyone who might possess a secret fortune or an influential connection. Each name that surfaced in her memory was quickly dismissed, leaving a bitter taste of helplessness. No one they knew had the kind of money that could erase a debt this colossal, a debt owed to people like the Thorns. Eleanor moved through the small house, her steps hushed, as if even the floorboards might betray her search. She pulled dusty directories from shelves, their pages brittle and yellowed with age. Her fingers skimmed over entries for loan agencies, legal aid services, even obscure financial consultants. The scent of old paper and accumulated dust filled her nostrils, a stark contrast to the sterile, intimidating power represented by the Thorn card. Each number she dialed led to a dead end, a polite refusal, or a dismissive tone that underscored the futility of her efforts. She tried the internet, her laptop glowing ominously in the dim light of her bedroom. Search terms like debt relief, financial restructuring, and emergency loans yielded page after page of generic advice and scams. The screen's cold light reflected in her hazel eyes, which were now raw from lack of sleep and unshed tears. She imagined the cold, calculating eyes of Victoria Thorn, and a shiver ran down her spine. The air in the room grew heavy, almost oppressive, as hours bled into each other. Her throat felt parched, her voice hoarse from the few hushed conversations she had managed. Arthur Vance watched his daughter from the doorway of the living room, his own face etched with profound misery. He clutched a mug of lukewarm tea, its steam long vanished. The smell of Eleanor's frantic energy mingled with the lingering scent of fear in the house. He saw her slumped over the laptop, her long auburn hair falling across her face, hiding the exhaustion there. Every rejected call, every frustrated sigh, was a fresh stab of guilt in his already shattered heart. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some comfort, but no words came. He could only stand there, a specter of his former self, consumed by his regret. Eleanor finally pushed the laptop away, the click of the lid echoing in the sudden silence. The cold despair settled deeper within her. There was no escape. She had exhausted every avenue, every desperate hope. The weight of her father's life, of their entire future, pressed down on her fragile shoulders. Her fingers locked around the ceramic mug she held, the warmth a small, fleeting comfort against the chill of her certainty. She knew if she let go, she would shatter it, just as her world was shattering around her. Then a sharp, insistent rap echoed through the quiet house. It was not the gentle knock of a neighbor or the familiar chime of a delivery service. This was a deliberate, authoritative sound that sent an immediate jolt of fear through Eleanor. Arthur Vance flinched, spilling a few drops of his cold tea. The air thickened with unspoken dread. Eleanor rose slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She moved towards the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the frosted glass, she could make out a tall, dark silhouette. A man stood on their porch, impeccably dressed, his posture rigid. The scent of an expensive foreign cologne seemed to seep through the very wood of the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Arthur Vance appeared beside her, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His hand trembled as he reached for the door. "It's them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It has to be." He opened the door a crack. A man with sharp, unfeeling eyes and a precisely trimmed mustache stood on their porch. He held a thick, leather-bound document, adorned with an ornate, unfamiliar crest. The very sight of it sent a fresh wave of nausea through Eleanor. This was the physical manifestation of her doom. "Arthur Vance?" The lawyer's voice was crisp, devoid of any warmth. His words cut through the tense silence like a surgeon's scalpel. Arthur nodded, unable to speak, his gaze fixed on the ominous document. "I am Mr. Davies, representing the Thorne family," the lawyer stated, his eyes sweeping over the humble interior of the Vance residence with an almost imperceptible sneer. He extended the heavy document. "This is the formal marriage contract as agreed upon." The document was bound in dark, embossed leather, its edges sharp and unyielding. The Thorne family crest, a stylized, predatory bird, was stamped in gold upon its cover. It felt unnervingly cold in Eleanor's hands when she finally took it, its weight a physical burden. Its pages were filled with dense legalese, words that twisted and turned, each one binding her tighter to a life she did not choose. There was a single, stark signature when at the bottom, waiting for her father's trembling hand. Mr. Davies continued, his voice a low, even monotone. "The terms are precise. The marriage must take place within 3 weeks. All associated debts will be formally discharged upon the legal union. Any deviation, any delay, will result in the immediate and full forfeiture of the agreement." Eleanor stared at the lawyer, her mind reeling. 3 weeks. That was no time at all. She felt a burning question rise to her lips, but the lawyer's cold, unwavering gaze silenced her before she could utter a sound. He offered no pleasantries, no condolences, only the harsh, unvarnished truth of their situation. He smelled of polished leather and a faint, acrid ink, a scent that now seemed to cling to her own hands. "The Thornes expect full cooperation," Mr. Davies concluded, his eyes fixed on Eleanor for a moment that felt like an eternity. "Understand that refusal is not an option." With that, he turned, his expensive shoes clicking softly on their worn porch steps. He entered a waiting black car that had been parked discreetly down the street. The vehicle pulled away, leaving behind only the heavy contract and an even heavier silence. The air in the house still carried a faint trace of his sharp cologne, a lingering reminder of the chilling encounter. Eleanor clutched the contract, her knuckles white. It was a cold, official instrument of her sacrifice. The hours that followed were a blur of numb despair. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the contract spread open before her. Her father, defeated, had retreated to his armchair, his face buried in his hands. The detailed clauses of the document swam before her eyes, each one a nail in the coffin of her former life. She traced the words "full legal binding" and "irrevocable union" with a detached sense of horror. A sudden sharp ring of the telephone startled both of them. It was not the usual gentle trill, but an insistent, almost demanding sound. Eleanor looked at the receiver, a strange premonition settling in her gut. She reached for it, her hand shaking. The plastic felt surprisingly warm against her cold fingers. "Eleanor Vance," a voice stated, devoid of inflection, yet radiating an undeniable authority. It was a woman's voice, low and resonant, carrying an undercurrent of steel. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She knew immediately who it was. The sharp scent of expensive perfume, carried on a subtle breeze from the open window, seemed to materialize in the room. "This is Victoria Thorne," the voice continued, leaving no room for doubt. "I believe you have received my family's proposal." Eleanor swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, Mrs. Thorne," she managed, her own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter, her mind racing, searching for words she didn't have. She could almost taste the fear, sharp and metallic in her mouth. "Good," Victoria said, a chillingly calm response. "I prefer to be direct. There will be no further delays. The contract is clear. Your father's debt will be cleared and his safety ensured upon your marriage to my son, Julian." Eleanor felt a surge of desperate courage. "But, Mrs. Thorne, isn't there another way? We could sell the house, or I could work to repay a portion of it. Anything but this." Her voice cracked, betraying the raw emotion she fought to suppress. The words tumbled out, a desperate plea into the void. There was a brief pause on the other end, a silence that felt heavy with disapproval. When Victoria spoke again, her voice had dropped, becoming softer, yet infinitely more menacing. "My dear Eleanor, you do not understand the scale of this arrangement. There is no other way. Your father made a choice, and now you must make yours." Her words were precise, each syllable weighted with implicit threat. Eleanor looked towards her father, who had lifted his head, his eyes wide with terror as he listened to her side of the conversation. His gaze pleaded with her, a silent, desperate warning. He was frail, visibly broken, and she knew in that moment that his life truly hung in the balance. "What if I refuse?" Eleanor asked, the words a defiant whisper, though her heart hammered like a trapped bird. The very air in the room seemed to grow cold around her. She could feel the chill seeping into her bones. A soft, almost imperceptible chuckle came from Victoria Thorne. It was a sound entirely devoid of humor, a chilling acknowledgement of Eleanor's naivety. "Refusal, my dear, is not an option available to you. Think of your father. Think of what happens to those who disappoint the Thornes." Her voice remained unnervingly calm, but the implication was stark, painting a vivid picture of danger. Eleanor's vision blurred. The images that flashed through her mind were not graphic, but they were terrifying. She saw her father alone, vulnerable, facing the ruthless machinery of the Thorne family. She saw the quiet peace of their small home shattered, their lives irrevocably destroyed. She knew Victoria Thorne was not speaking of financial penalties. She was speaking of something far more brutal, far more final. The scent of ozone seemed to hang in the air, a premonition of lightning. "You understand then," Victoria stated, her voice returning to its normal, controlled cadence, a subtle note of triumph now present. "The wedding preparations will begin immediately. Mr. Davies will be in touch with the details." Before Eleanor could respond, the line went dead. The click of the receiver was sharp, final. She slowly lowered the phone, her hand still trembling. The air in the room was thick with unspoken fear, the silence now more profound than before. Arthur Vance was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. Eleanor felt a profound, desolate coldness settle in her chest. Victoria Thorne's cold smile, unseen but acutely felt, lingered in Eleanor's mind. It was a silent threat, a chilling promise of dire consequences if she dared to defy the Thorne family. Eleanor watched her father closely in the days that followed Victoria Thorne's visit. His shoulders seemed to slump even lower. His kind eyes now held a constant, distant gaze. He barely touched his food. The smell of his favorite stew, usually a comfort, now seemed to deepen his sadness. Eleanor tried to coax him, to talk about anything but the debt, but his responses were short, almost whispers. One evening, as the autumn wind rattled the windows of their small Victorian home, Arthur Vance was reading in his worn armchair. The lamp beside him cast a warm but inadequate glow on his face. He let out a sudden, sharp gasp. The book, a worn copy of his favorite adventure novel, slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Eleanor, who had been sketching quietly at the kitchen table, lost her concentration immediately. The charcoal stick rolled from her grasp, leaving a dark smudge on her drawing. She rushed in, her chair scraping harshly against the wooden floorboards. Her heart immediately tightened, a cold, hard knot forming in her chest. "Father, what is it?" she asked, her voice tight with alarm, fear coiling in her stomach. He clutched at his chest, his face draining of color, turning a sickly pale. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a struggle, like a bird trapped in a narrow space, fighting for air. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on his brow, catching the dim light, even in the cool evening air that seeped through the old window panes. His eyes, usually so gentle and kind, were now wide with terror, darting around the familiar room as if searching for an escape that was not there, for a safe harbor from the storm raging within him. He tried to speak, to form words, but only a strangled, guttural sound emerged, a sound of pure agony. Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her, numbing her fingers and toes. This was not just sadness, not merely distress. This was something far more terrifying, a breaking point. She saw the fear in his eyes, raw and primal, a terror that mirrored the one growing inside her, threatening to consume her own fragile composure. His fingers clawed at his shirt, tearing at the fabric over his chest, his body beginning to tremble uncontrollably, a violent tremor that shook his entire frame. He was drowning, she realized, not in water, but in an invisible current of fear and despair, an undertow pulling him down into an abyss she could not reach. "I need to call someone," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, already fumbling for the phone on the small side table. Her hands shook almost as much as his, making the buttons difficult to press. She dialed their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a kind retired nurse who lived 2 doors down. While she waited for the ringing to stop, she knelt beside her father, trying to ease his breathing, whispering soothing words that felt hollow even to her own ears. The scent of fear, sharp and metallic, seemed to fill the room, clinging to the air like a shroud. Mrs. Henderson arrived quickly, her face etched with concern, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the wooden floor. She took charge with a calm efficiency that Eleanor desperately needed, her steady presence a small comfort in the chaos. "He needs a doctor, Eleanor," she said, her voice firm but gentle, her eyes assessing Arthur's distressed state. "This looks like a panic attack, but we must be sure it is nothing more serious." The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity and hushed voices. The doctor, a kind man with tired eyes and a gentle demeanor, confirmed it was a severe panic attack, brought on by extreme stress and overwhelming anxiety. He gave Arthur a mild sedative to help him rest, explaining the importance of absolute quiet. As the medication took hold, Arthur's frantic grip on Eleanor's hand loosened, and his breathing became less ragged, settling into a more regular, though still shallow rhythm. His face, though still pale and drawn, finally softened into a troubled sleep, the lines of worry temporarily smoothed away. Eleanor sat by his bedside, the silence of the room broken only by her father's shallow breaths and the distant hoot of an owl in the ancient oak tree outside. She watched him, seeing the years of worry etched deeper into his face during this ordeal. Each line, each shadow told a story of burdens he had carried alone, secrets he had kept hidden. The weight of his guilt, she understood, was now crushing him, manifesting in this terrifying physical way. It was a visible, tangible manifestation of the invisible chains that bound them, holding them captive. She felt a profound ache in her chest, a mixture of fear for his health and a terrible rising anger at the merciless forces that had brought him to this point. His fragile state was a stark, undeniable reminder of the unbearable stakes. This was not just about money. It was about life and breath, about the very existence of her beloved father. The following morning, a thin, persistent drizzle fell outside, mirroring the gloom within the house. The sky was a uniform, oppressive gray, and the air was heavy with dampness. Eleanor had made her father some weak tea and toast, which he picked at without enthusiasm, his appetite still absent. The doctor had insisted on rest and no further stress, a cruel irony given their situation, a command almost impossible to obey. As Eleanor went to retrieve the morning mail from their letterbox, a small, unassuming wooden box attached to the side of the house, which always squeaked faintly on its rusted hinges, She felt a familiar knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. Most days brought only bills and junk mail, easily dismissed. Today, however, something felt different. A chill wind of premonition blowing through her. As she pulled open the small wooden door, her fingers brushed against something cold and foreign. It was not the usual stack of white envelopes. Tucked among the handful of bills and a colorful flyer for a local pizzeria was a single, small, perfectly formed white rose. Its petals were flawless, untouched, like something from a florist's display, its stem carefully trimmed. But it lay on a bed of dark, rich earth, spilled from a small, clear plastic bag, staining the bottom of the letterbox with dark soil. A shiver traced its way down Eleanor's spine, cold and insistent, as if an icy finger had brushed her neck. She picked it up, the petals cool and soft against her skin, almost velvety. The soil was damp, smelling faintly of decay and something metallic, like old pennies. It was an earth smell, but not a comforting garden scent, rather one of a fresh grave. Then she saw it. Pinned to the rose's stem, almost invisible against the pristine white petals, was a tiny, intricately folded piece of parchment, no larger than her thumbnail. Her fingers trembled, making the delicate paper rustle as she unfolded it. The message was brief, written in elegant, precise script, each letter perfectly formed, almost too perfect. Time waits for no one, Miss Vance. Some flowers, once plucked, cannot be replaced. No signature, no overt threat of violence, no explicit warning, just those words chilling in their understatement, their unspoken implications. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and lightheaded. It was not just a message, it was an act, a deliberate, calculated intrusion. Someone had come to their quiet, unassuming home, had placed this morbid floral arrangement in their letterbox, a clear sign that they were being watched, that their every move was known. The image of Victoria Thorne's unblinking sapphire eyes flashed in her mind, cold and calculating. This was her handiwork, a subtle but utterly terrifying reminder of the Thornes' immense reach, their pervasive influence. The rose, so delicate and beautiful, felt like a funeral bloom, a symbol of something lost, something taken away forever. It spoke of finality, of irreversible actions, of a point of no return. It implied that waiting, hoping for another way, would only lead to irreparable harm, to a devastating consequence. Her father's life, his fragile health, was the flower being referenced, vulnerable and precious. She swallowed hard, the taste of ashes in her mouth, her throat tight with fear. The air suddenly felt thick, heavy with unspoken menace, pressing down on her. The silence of the house, usually a comfort, now felt like a shroud, a suffocating blanket of dread. She clutched the rose, its tiny thorns pricking her palm. The small wounds felt like a physical manifestation of her utter powerlessness, a painful reminder that her fate was no longer her own. That night, sleep was an impossible dream for Eleanor. Her father was settled, or as settled as he could be, the mild sedative having finally lulled him into a deep, if restless, slumber. Each shallow breath he took was a testament to his fragile state, a sound that filled the quiet room and echoed in Eleanor's own chest. She sat by his bedside once more, the familiar comfort of his presence now tinged with a profound sadness. The faint glow of the moon, a pale orb in the night sky, filtered through the window, painting the room in shades of silver and shadow. It cast long, dancing patterns across the worn rug, making familiar objects seem alien and watchful. The white rose lay on her bedside table, a stark, unsettling presence, its perfect petals now seeming to mock the imperfection of her life. Its gentle beauty felt like a morbid decoration, a symbol of something precious taken too soon. Every rustle of the autumn leaves outside, every creak of the old house settling into the night, seemed amplified, carrying a new, sinister weight, as if the very air whispered of impending doom. Her mind replayed the events of the past few days, a terrifying, relentless loop. The shock of her father's confession, the chilling encounter with Victoria Thorne, her desperate, futile attempts to find another path, and now her father's physical collapse. It was a dizzying descent into a nightmare, each step pulling her further from the life she knew. She thought of her father, Arthur Vance, once so full of quiet joy and gentle laughter, his eyes always twinkling when he spoke of her artistic talents. Now he was a shadow of his former self, broken by a debt he could not repay, consumed by a guilt that had begun to devour him from the inside out. His guilt was a visible burden, heavier than any physical chain, warping his posture, dulling his spirit. She remembered his gentle hands teaching her to sketch, guiding her fingers across the paper, his patient explanations of complex stories from ancient texts, his unwavering support for her dreams of becoming an artist. He had always wanted her to be happy, to live a life free from worry, to pursue the beauty she saw in the world. Now she was the only one who could truly protect him, the only one standing between him and the abyss. The full weight of the sacrifice settled upon her shoulders, a crushing, suffocating burden that made it hard to draw a full breath. To marry a stranger, a man from a world she neither understood nor wanted. To become part of the Thorne family, to live in the ominous Blackwood Manor. She imagined the vast, silent halls, the cold stone echoing with unseen power, the watchful eyes of Victoria Thorne and her formidable household. Her artistic dreams, her quiet life filled with the scent of turpentine and freshly brewed tea, her very self, would be swallowed by that impenetrable darkness. A profound sense of loss washed over her, a grief so deep it felt physical, a sharp ache beneath her ribs for the future she would never have, for the simple joys she was giving up. Tears pricked at her eyes, burning like embers, but she refused to let them fall. She could not afford to break, not now, not when he needed her to be strong. She was the last wall standing. She envisioned the marriage contract, the legal document that would bind her forever. Its embossed leather cover a symbol of its unyielding authority. It wasn't just a signature on paper. It was a surrender of her freedom, her choices, her identity. She would become a thorn, a piece of property in a powerful, dangerous game, a hostage in a gilded cage. The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through her, so potent it made her stomach clench. Yet, when she looked at her father's pale, vulnerable face, illuminated by the soft moonlight, all her fear and resentment momentarily faded, replaced by an overwhelming wave of fierce, protective love. He was her anchor, her only family, the root of her entire world. His life was paramount, more important than her own dreams, more precious than her freedom. She thought of Victoria Thorne's cold, unwavering gaze, the implicit threats that resonated in her crisp, authoritative voice. There was no escape. They had made sure of that. The White Rose, a silent harbinger of their power, her father's terrifying panic attack, the lawyer's unyielding demeanor. Each was a stone in the wall closing around her, brick by painful brick. She closed her eyes, picturing her own reflection in the small vanity mirror across the room, seeing the girl she was, and trying with a terrifying effort to imagine the woman she would become. The change would be irreversible, a metamorphosis she had no control over. The girl who loved to paint, who found solace in quiet moments of creation, would have to disappear, or at least hide herself deep within. In her place, a new person would emerge, one capable of surviving in that harsh, unforgiving world, one strong enough to protect her father. It was a terrifying prospect, but the alternative was unthinkable. A quiet sob escaped her father's lips, even in his troubled sleep, and his hand twitched restlessly on the worn blanket. Eleanor reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, taking his frail hand in hers. His skin felt cool, almost translucent, fragile beneath her touch. She interlaced her fingers with his, a silent promise passing between them, a desperate embrace of their last shared moments of innocence, of normalcy. She squeezed his hand gently, conveying all the unspoken words of comfort and resolve, pouring her strength into his tired form. She would do it. She would walk into that gilded cage, into that unknown future. For him. She would face whatever terrors awaited her within the Thorne estate. For him. Her heart ached with a deep, burning sadness, a profound sense of injustice. But beneath it, a quiet, unyielding strength began to simmer, a resolve she had not known she possessed. She would not let him crumble. She would be his shield, his silent guardian. no matter the cost to herself. A soft, almost inaudible murmur escaped his lips. Eleanor leaned closer, straining to hear over the steady beat of her own heart. "My dear girl," he whispered, his voice thin and raw, even in sleep, a fragile whisper carried on a breath. A single tear, warm and heavy, escaped the corner of his closed eye, tracing a path down his temple, a silent confession of his agony. "Forgive me." The words, barely audible, carried the full weight of his despair, his guilt, his profound helplessness. They were an apology not just for the debt, but for the shattered dreams, for the life he was forcing her to lead, for the future he was unknowingly taking from her. Eleanor's own throat tightened, a painful constriction that made it difficult to swallow. Her eyes welled up again, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them back, fiercely. She could not cry. Not now. Not when he was so vulnerable. She squeezed his hand again, a silent absolution, a silent promise. His apology, though whispered in a dream, felt like a sacred vow, a final plea that she had no choice but to answer. In that moment, holding his hand, feeling the fragile beat of his pulse beneath her fingers, she knew her decision was truly, irrevocably made. The weight of it pressed down, heavy and unyielding, a stone in her chest, but it also solidified her resolve, forging it into something hard and durable. Her fate was sealed. It was decided not by a signed contract, not by the cold words of a lawyer, but by the overwhelming love and searing pain that bound her to this man, her father. Her heart, though bruised and aching with a grief she had yet to fully comprehend, accepted its path, its bitter destiny. The dark, embossed leather of the marriage contract lay spread across the old oak dining table. Its weight felt immense, a physical presence absorbing all the light from the room. Eleanor could almost feel the chill emanating from its pages, a cold promise of a future she did not choose. She watched the Thorne family lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, whose presence alone felt like an intrusion in their quiet home. His movements were precise, almost surgical, as he adjusted the document. He wore a suit the color of a winter night, a stark contrast to the faded warmth of their living space. Every line of his face was smooth, devoid of any discernible emotion, like a sculpture carved from ice. He carried an air of clinical efficiency, as if this signing was just another routine transaction in a long day of acquiring and binding. Arthur Vance sat opposite him, hunched over the table, his shoulders slumped, carrying an invisible burden that seemed to press him into the worn wood. He looked smaller, frailer than Eleanor had ever seen him. The overhead lamp, usually a comforting glow, now seemed to cast harsh shadows on his face, highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion and despair around his eyes. His hands, usually so steady when he sketched with her or fixed something around the house, trembled uncontrollably, a constant tremor shaking his whole frame. Eleanor could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a dull thud against her ribs, mimicking the frantic rhythm of her father's fear. She stood a few paces behind him, a silent sentinel, her gaze fixed on the back of his head, willing strength into him, knowing it was futile. The air in the room was thick, heavy with unspoken grief, and the metallic tang of what felt like impending doom. It smelled faintly of old paper and the lingering scent of her father's anxiety, a sharp, coppery scent that pricked at her nose. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the barely audible rustle of the contract as Mr. Davies straightened it one last time. Eleanor remembered the day her father had bought that clock, its polished wood gleaming, a symbol of permanence and time stretching out before them. Now, each tick seemed to mark the seconds counting down to her own personal end. "Everything is in order, Mr. Vance," Mr. Davies said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. He slid a sleek, expensive-looking pen across the table. The small sound it made as it met the wood was shockingly loud in the profound quiet. "The signature line is clearly marked." Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into the soft flesh of her palms. She wanted to rush forward, to snatch the pen away, to tear the paper to shreds. She wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice, to remind them that this was a person's life, not a parcel of land or a stock certificate. But her voice was trapped, a raw, aching knot in her chest. She had promised her father. She had made her choice. Now she had to stand witness to its finalization. She had to watch him carry out the sacrifice they had both agreed upon, though the decision had been hers alone to make. Her father's gaze was fixed on the signature line, a blank space that would soon hold his name, and with it, her fate. He swallowed hard, a visible bob of his Adam's apple. His eyes were red-rimmed, heavy with unshed tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss he had inadvertently created for his only child. Eleanor felt a profound, aching pity for him, but also a quiet anger. He had done this to them. He had made the mistakes that led them here, to this cold, stark moment. But the anger was quickly overshadowed by love, by the desperate knowledge that he was hurting more than she could ever comprehend. His hand, the one that used to carefully guide her own hand as she learned to sketch, now reached out, wavering like a leaf caught in a strong wind. It hovered over the pen, trembling. Eleanor's gaze was locked on that hand, on each shaky movement. It was a familiar hand, one that had held her as a baby, had wiped her tears, had offered comfort and reassurance throughout her 22 years. Now it was poised to sign away her very existence. The simple act of picking up a pen had never held such monumental weight, such devastating finality. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, a silent plea to a God she no longer believed in. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot path down his cheek, landing silently on the smooth wood of the table. He took a ragged, shuddering breath. Eleanor could almost taste the salt of his tears in the air, a bitter offering. The smell of fear intensified, mingling with the faint, sweet scent of the potpourri on the side table, a jarring contrast. Her own stomach churned, a cold, empty ache spreading through her. She felt disconnected, as if she were watching this scene unfold from a great distance, a silent observer in her own tragedy. With an almost imperceptible movement, his fingers closed around the pen. It seemed too heavy for him, too unwieldy. The soft click of the cap being removed echoed in the hushed room, a sound that would forever be etched into Eleanor's memory. Her father's chest heaved once, twice. His chin began to quiver. He leaned forward, his face contorted in a silent struggle, his whole body tense with the effort. Eleanor could hear the wet, choked sound in his throat, a muffled sob he desperately tried to suppress. It broke her heart to hear it, to see the extent of his pain, knowing she was the cause and the solution. His head bowed low, almost touching the contract. His arm extended, the pen poised over the line. Eleanor felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Every nerve ending in her body was screaming, a silent, internal clamor that threatened to shatter the fragile composure she had built around herself. She wanted to grab him, to pull him back from the brink, to tell him it was not too late, that they could find another way, but the words died before they could form. Her body remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mixture of duty and despair. Then, with a shuddering gasp that ripped through the silence of the room, he lowered the pen. The scratch of nib on paper was a harsh, unforgiving sound. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place, of chains being forged, of an irreversible decree. Eleanor watched, her vision blurring, as his hand moved slowly, painstakingly, forming the familiar loops and angles of his signature. Each stroke felt like a nail hammered into her coffin. Tears streamed freely down her father's face now, glistening on the dark wood as they fell, mingling with the ink. He was weeping openly, unashamedly, his body racked with silent sobs that shook the entire table. He finished. The pen clattered softly to the table, released from his trembling grip. His hand immediately went to his face, covering his eyes as if to hide from the enormity of what he had just done. A guttural sound, part sob, part groan, escaped his lips. It was a sound of profound anguish, a testament to the agony of a father forced to sacrifice his child. Eleanor watched him, tears finally spilling from her own eyes, hot and stinging as they traced paths down her cold cheeks. The warmth of the old house, the comfort of her familiar surroundings, seemed to drain away, leaving behind a hollow, desolate echo. Mr. Davies, unmoved by the raw display of grief, reached out a hand. His fingers, long and unblemished, carefully lifted the signed contract from the table. He held it up, inspecting it briefly, a faint, almost imperceptible glint in his otherwise impassive eyes. It was a flicker of triumph, a momentary crack in his professional facade that confirmed the cold, calculating nature of the Thorne family. He then folded the document with crisp, efficient movements, tucking it into a slim leather portfolio. The soft snap of the clasp reverberated through the now utterly silent room. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the empty space where the contract had been. Her life, her very future, had just been reduced to a few lines of ink on a piece of paper, now held captive within that dark portfolio. The chilling realization settled over her, heavy and absolute, that her life was no longer her own. The car door closed with a quiet thud. Eleanor watched her home shrink in the distance, her face pressed to the cold glass. Arthur stood on the porch, shoulders slumped. He did not wave. His hands still trembled from the pen stroke that sealed her fate. A heavy sadness clung to her, grief for a life now irrevocably gone. The Thorne lawyer sat in front, his posture rigid. The rustle of his suit reminded her of the ironclad agreement. Eleanor sat in the back, plush leather offering no comfort against her cold dread. The new car scent mixed with something metallic, a sterile promise of her new existence. Each turn of the wheel pulled her further from her home, from who she had been. Her breath hitched. She fought back tears. Crying would only confirm her powerlessness since Victoria Thorne's demands. She was a pawn sacrificed to protect her father. The thought was bitter. She clenched her jaw. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the girl who painted and dreamed. She was an instrument, a bride for Julian Thorne. The journey felt endless. Each mile deepened the chasm to her terrifying future. The city faded to quieter roads, lined with ancient trees, a foreboding canopy. Through a break in the foliage, she saw Blackwood Manor. It rose like a silent fortress of dark stone, its spires piercing the sky. Her breath caught. It was not a home, but a monument to Thorne power. The car swept up the winding drive, past manicured gardens. Her imagination painted her confinement within the stone walls. The heavy oak doors swung open silently as the car approached, revealing a dimly lit entryway. Two figures in dark suits stood on either side, faces unreadable. A shiver traced her spine. This was her gilded cage, the bars already closing. Inside, the air was heavy with polished wood, faint cigar smoke, and old money. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor as she was led through the entrance hall. The silence was absolute, broken only by her heels. It felt oppressive, as if the walls listened. The Thorne lawyer gestured towards a sweeping staircase into shadow. Eleanor ascended, gripping the cold banister, her heart a frantic drum. On the upper landing, Victoria Thorne waited, formidable in a tailored dark suit. Her silver hair in a severe bun, her piercing blue eyes swept over Eleanor. There was no warmth, only a cool, assessing scrutiny that made Eleanor feel like an object. A tall woman with a detached expression stood beside Victoria, a measuring tape on her arm. This was the seamstress. "Eleanor." Victoria's voice was crisp, devoid of emotion. "Our time is limited. The wedding is in 2 days. We have much to do." 2 days, the words hit Eleanor hard. 2 days until she became Mrs. Julian Thorne, a name that felt alien. She swallowed, meeting Victoria's unwavering gaze. Her hazel eyes were carefully blank, betraying no turmoil. She would not break for Victoria. "Of course, Mrs. Thorne," Eleanor managed, her voice softer than she intended, a tremor betraying her resolve. Victoria inclined her head, a gesture of command. "Lillian here will see to your bridal fittings. Every detail must be perfect. You will represent the Thorne name, Eleanor. There is no room for imperfection." Her words were a warning, a reminder of Thorne expectation. Lillian led Eleanor into a dressing room, its walls lined with mirrors. Silks and satins hung on gleaming racks, whispering opulence. Eleanor felt a strange disconnect. These beautiful gowns were not for her, the girl who preferred comfortable clothes and art. They were costumes for a forced role. Victoria Thorne followed, seating herself on a velvet chaise lounge, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. It was an unnerving scrutiny, making Eleanor aware of her simple dress and worn shoes, marking her as an outsider. Lillian, with swift movements, began to unbutton Eleanor's dress. Eleanor felt a blush creep up her neck, exposed under Victoria's stare. She was stripped of her clothes, her modesty, her very self. "Stand straight, Eleanor," Victoria commanded, her voice cutting through the silence. "The posture of a thorn bride must be impeccable." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, but a defiant spark died under Victoria's authority. She felt like a mannequin, manipulated and judged. Lillian presented the first gown, heavy ivory lace and satin. It was beautiful but felt like a shroud. As Lillian helped her into it, the fabric felt cold, scratchy. Pins pricked her skin, tiny stabs mirroring the ache in her heart. "Too much lace," Victoria declared, her voice sharp. "It distracts from the line, and the neckline is too modest. We need something more striking, something that commands attention." Eleanor wanted to scream, to disappear into her old life, but the words remained trapped in her throat, a silent protest. Lillian, immune to the tension, brought out another dress. This one was shimmering silk, its neckline plunging deeper, its train sweeping the floor. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Better, but the waist needs to be cinched more. A thorn bride should always appear formidable. Elegant, yes, but with an underlying strength." Strength, Eleanor scoffed internally. She felt like a leaf in a storm, powerless. Yet she stood there, allowing herself to be poked and prodded, molded into Victoria Thorne's image. Each pin, each instruction, felt like another layer of the mask she was forced to wear. The process continued for hours, an assault on her spirit. Gown after gown was tried on, critiqued, adjusted. She watched her reflection, seeing less of herself. The girl who sketched and dreamed was erased, replaced by an elegant stranger. Her true self buried deep, a spark of defiance flickering. After the fittings, Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, took over. She had a no-nonsense demeanor and quiet authority. Eleanor was led through a maze of hallways, each grander, more impersonal. The air grew heavier, the silence more profound. Her footsteps echoed hollowly, a reminder of the emptiness in this house. "This is the grand ballroom, miss," Mrs. Davies stated, her voice flat as she pushed open double doors. Eleanor stepped inside and her breath caught. The Onyx Gallery Ballroom. It was a cavernous space, adorned with crystal chandeliers catching the dim light. The marble floor gleamed, reflecting the dark tapestries. It was breathtaking, majestic, devoid of warmth. This, she realized with dread, was where her wedding would take place. Her forced vows would echo in this cold hall. She imagined herself walking down that long aisle, her heart a heavy stone. She saw Julian Thorne waiting, a stranger she had not yet met. The image sent a shiver, a premonition of their cold union. She felt a profound isolation standing alone in the center of the room. It was not a place for celebration, but for performance. Mrs. Davies continued the tour, her monotonous voice pointing out the wings, dining room, reception rooms. Each room was meticulously decorated, filled with antique furniture, art, and history. Yet each felt unused, untouched, stages for unseen drama. There were no personal touches, no warmth. The house was a museum, not a home. "This is your suite, miss," Mrs. Davies finally announces, opening another heavy door. Eleanor stepped into a suite larger than her Vance residence. A four-poster bed, draped in silks, dominated the bedroom. There was a sitting area with a velvet sofa, two armchairs, a vanity with a silver mirror, and a walk-in closet. A large window overlooked the manicured grounds, but the view felt distant, like a painting. She walked to the window, placing her hand on the cold glass. The ancient woods surrounding Blackwood Manor pressed in, their dark branches like skeletal fingers. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage, bars invisible but present. Her old home, her art studio, her possessions felt a million miles away, a different lifetime. The thought of her father alone brought a wave of pain. Had she done enough? Was he safe? Uncertainty gnawed at her, adding to the suffocating weight. She was sacrificing everything, yet felt a lack of control. Her fate, her father's, rested with the Thornes. She turned from the window, her gaze falling upon an ornate mirror. Slowly she walked towards it, her reflection emerging. She saw a young woman with haunted hazel eyes, auburn hair disheveled from fittings. The simple dress seemed out of place in the opulent room. A maid who had entered silently held out a dress. It was not a wedding gown, but an elegant, emerald green evening dress, shimmering silk. "Mrs. Thorne requests you wear this for dinner this evening, Miss Vance," the maid said softly but firmly. Eleanor took the dress, the fabric cool against her fingers. With a sigh, she began to unbutton her own dress, letting it fall. She slipped on the emerald gown. It was expertly tailored, hugging her figure in a way her own clothes never did. The silk flowed around her, luxurious and unfamiliar. She turned back to the mirror, her eyes scanning her reflection. A stranger stared back. The girl who left her home, filled with grief and desperate hope, was no longer recognizable. This woman in the expensive gown, with forced posture and blank expression, was someone else. She was a thorn, a possession, a bride-to-be molded by another. A profound sense of loss washed over her, an emptiness echoing through the silent room. The girl with dreams and an artistic soul was gone, swallowed by Blackwood Manor. Gray light seeped through Blackwood Manor's drapes, staining the opulent room. Eleanor Vance lay still, deep despair her companion. Her eyes were open, unfocused on the ceiling. Silk sheets felt cool, alien, like a shroud. A vast emptiness echoed her lost life. Today, she would become Mrs. Thorne. A quiet knock disturbed the stillness. A young maid, calm but reserved, entered with a tea tray. Its faint floral scent felt intrusive. Eleanor sat up stiffly. She took the cup, fingers trembling. The tea tasted of bitterness and regret. More maids followed, their hushed whispers filling the air. They laid out delicate undergarments, silken stockings, a white slip. Each item felt like a costume. Eleanor watched with detachment, observing a sacrificial preparation. Lavender mixed with the tea's cloying sweetness. Fabric rustle and porcelain clicks marked her new reality. The telephone's cold ring pierced the calm. Eleanor flinched, her heart pounding with unwelcome anticipation. The maid answered, then held out the receiver. "It's your father, Miss Vance," she murmured. Eleanor's breath hitched, the cup clattered. She took the receiver. "Father?" Her voice was a strained whisper. Arthur Vance's voice was a ragged sigh, laced with guilt and sorrow. "Eleanor, my dear girl." He sounded thick, fighting tears. "It's your day." Eleanor closed her eyes, a sharp ache behind her lids. She pictured him alone in their small living room, hunched, tired, blaming himself. "Yes, Father," she managed, the word tasting like ash. I wanted to wish you, well," he stammered, voice cracking. "I hope you find some happiness." His broken sincerity was a fresh wound. He offered comfort, but only deepened her despair. How could happiness exist? Only suffocating surrender. She gripped the receiver, knuckles white, feeling the ghost of his trembling hand from when he signed the contract. "Thank you, Father." She forced past her throat. Her eyes burned. "I have to go now." "Yes, my love. Be brave." His voice faded, the call ending. Eleanor placed the receiver back. The silence felt heavier, profound. It filled with unspoken apologies, echoes of a broken promise. Her father's lingering sorrow. Tears welled, hot, insistent, but she blinked them back. No time for tears now. The maids, sensing her demeanor shift, resumed the work. They began preparing her, a ritualistic transformation. Her delicate hands were manicured. Her auburn hair, usually a simple knot, was coaxed into an intricate style. She felt the tug of brushes, cool creams, the faint, unfamiliar scent of hairspray. They spoke in low tones, eyes avoiding hers, afraid to meet the gaze of a bride in mourning. Eleanor remained passive, her body a canvas. She watched her reflection, seeing a stranger take shape. This woman, adorned in finery, bore little resemblance to the girl who sketched by the window. Sarah, a young maid, gathered Eleanor's few belongings, books, worn clothes, a leather-bound object. It slipped from Sarah's grasp, landing gently on the thick carpet. Eleanor's eyes fixed on it, her sketchbook. A sharp breath escaped. The worn leather cover, scuffed over years, felt like a long-lost friend. A wave of potent longing washed over her. This small book held her truest self: charcoal landscapes, watercolor portraits, half-finished dreams. It was her sanctuary, her voice, her escape. Now a relic, packed away, a life beyond her reach. She reached out, fingers brushing the cover. A drawing flashed, her father laughing, before worry lines. Another memory, a windswept hill near their old home, capturing clouds. These pieces of her soul felt impossibly distant. Loss tightened her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She was losing herself piece by agonizing piece, for a debt not her own. Sarah, noticing Eleanor's gaze, picked up the sketchbook. "It's beautiful, Miss Vance," she said softly. Eleanor took it, holding it gently. Its weight was a comfort, a whisper of her true identity. She ran her thumb over the worn leather, feeling the ghost of countless hours poured onto its pages. This book was a testament to the artist, the dreamer, the girl who believed in beauty and freedom. Now that girl was buried under silken obligation. She longed to open it, to lose herself, to forget the cold reality. But there was no escape. With a shuddering breath, she handed it back. "Please put it away," she murmured, "with the other things." Sarah nodded, gently placing the book into a box. Eleanor watched it disappear, a piece of herself gone. A tear traced her cheek, quickly wiped away. Her chin lifted with fragile defiance. She would not break. Not yet. She could not. The final touches began. A delicate pearl necklace fastened around her throat, its cool weight a constant reminder of her gilded cage. A sheer, lace-edged veil covered her hair, obscuring her face, transforming her into an ethereal, yet trapped figure. Rose perfume, dabbed onto her wrists, added to the unfamiliar smells. She felt suffocated, encased in expensive fabric and false promises. Her wedding dress, a heavy creation of ivory lace and satin, rustled as the maids helped her stand. It was a masterpiece of design, meant for a princess. On Eleanor, it felt like a costume for a tragic play. The fabric was stiff, intricate embroidery scratching faintly against her skin. She felt tightness around her waist, weight on her shoulders, a physical manifestation of the burden she carried. Her reflection stared back, a beautiful vacant mask. Her hazel eyes, usually expressive, were shadowed with deep, silent anguish. Eleanor felt a cold dread trickle down her spine, a sensation so familiar, it was almost comforting. This was it, the moment she had been steeling herself for, the final step into the abyss. She took a deep breath, trying to find some semblance of courage, some forgotten fragment of her former self. As she moved towards the door, her steps felt heavy, each one a conscious effort. Her new shoes, exquisitely crafted, pinched slightly, a small, insistent pain mirroring the larger one in her heart. The long train of her gown whispered behind her on the polished floor. The grand halls of Blackwood Manor, usually silent, now hummed with faint, muffled sounds of distant voices, a murmur of expectation. Just as she reached the threshold, Sarah, the younger maid, stepped forward. She held out a delicate bouquet of white roses and lilies, their petals pristine and soft. The flowers carried a faint, sweet fragrance, a stark contrast to the bitter taste in Eleanor's mouth. Eleanor's fingers closed around the stems, feeling their cool, firm texture. The thorns, though trimmed, still seemed to prick at her skin, a subtle warning. She looked down at the bouquet, then back up at Sarah, who offered a small, fleeting smile, tinged with pity. Eleanor gripped the flowers tighter, her knuckles turning white. A sharp, sudden jolt coursed through her. She was about to walk down an aisle towards a man whose face she knew only from a fleeting, unsettling glance. A man she had never spoken to, never truly seen. She would bind herself to a stranger, a man representing everything she feared and resented. The weight of the bouquet, the heavy gown, the silent, expectant atmosphere, all pressed down. A profound realization settled in her bones. She was walking towards an entirely unknown future, an utterly alien life, with a man she had never even seen. The heavy gown felt like a shroud, not a celebration. Each whisper of silk against her legs echoed the crushing weight of her fate. Eleanor clutched her father's arm, his hand a tremor against her gloved fingers, as they approached the colossal doors of the Onyx Gallery ballroom. The delicate scent of lilies from her bouquet felt like a cruel irony, a fleeting beauty in a moment devoid of joy. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped within a cage of bone and lace. She could hear the muffled hum of voices, A low, indistinct murmur from beyond the thick wood. The air grew dense with unspoken expectation, making it hard to draw a full breath. A sudden rush of warmth, a wave of mingled perfumes and the faint tang of champagne washed over her as two impeccably dressed ushers moved forward. They grasped the ornate handles of the double doors, their movements synchronized and precise, like guardians of a sealed tomb. Eleanor's throat tightened, a dry knot of fear and resignation. She tasted the metallic tang of anxiety on her tongue. The doors swung inward with a slow, deliberate grace, revealing a dazzling, intimidating expanse. A gasp, almost imperceptible, escaped her lips. The room was vast, a cavern of polished marble and shimmering crystal. Hundreds of eyes, like countless pinpricks of light, turned simultaneously towards her. Each face was a blur of high society, adorned with expensive jewels and tailored garments, all focused with an unnerving intensity on the veiled bride. She felt utterly exposed, a specimen under a microscope, her deepest fears laid bare for these strangers to observe. A chill, despite the warmth of the crowded room, prickled her skin. She registered the rich scent of old money, a mix of polished wood and an unfamiliar, potent cologne filling the air. Her gaze, desperate and seeking, swept across the faces. None offered warmth, none offered comfort. They were the Thorne family's elite, their allies, their silent witnesses to this calculated transaction. Her father's grip tightened on her arm, a silent plea for strength. He was a shadow beside her, his presence a fragile anchor in a tempest of judgment. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, the long train of her dress rustling behind her, a sound swallowed by the cavernous space. Her eyes continued their frantic search, gliding past rows of curious onlookers, past the opulent floral arrangements that lined the aisle, past the shimmering candelabras. She saw only a blur of faces, a silent, scrutinizing crowd, all waiting for her to perform her part in this macabre play. Each step felt like an eternity, a deliberate march towards an unknown fate. The marble floor felt cold beneath her satin shoes, chilling her to the bone. Then her gaze halted. It was as though a magnet had pulled her eyes, pulling them across the room, past the sea of faces, to the very end of the aisle. There, standing tall and utterly still at the altar, was a figure cloaked in darkness. He was framed by the grand archway, a stark silhouette against the backdrop of stained glass windows that hinted at an older, forgotten history. The air around him seemed to thicken, to coalesce, drawing her attention with an undeniable force. This was him. This was Julian Thorne. She had built 1,000 images of him in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. She had pictured a brute, a shadowy figure, a man whose face would reflect the ruthlessness of his family. Yet, the man standing before her defied every expectation. He was tall, far taller than she had imagined. His frame lean, but powerful beneath the impeccably tailored dark suit. His posture was rigid, almost regal, radiating an undeniable aura of control and authority. He stood with an unnerving stillness, a silent sentinel awaiting her arrival. Her heart gave a sickening lurch. He was not looking away. His dark, intense eyes, the color of a stormy night sky, were fixed directly upon her. Even from this distance, through the delicate lace of her veil, she felt the piercing weight of his gaze. It was a look that offered no welcome, no warmth, no hint of a shared future. Instead, it was a gaze of raw, unyielding intensity, a silent assessment that stripped away her defenses. She felt herself tremble, a tiny, involuntary tremor that began deep within her and spread outwards. The details of his face began to sharpen as she drew closer, each feature carved with a precision that was almost startling. A strong jawline, a straight nose, lips that were thin and unsmiling. His dark hair was swept back from his forehead, revealing a high, intelligent brow. There was a stark beauty to his features, a cold, unyielding handsomeness that spoke of power and an impenetrable inner world. He was a man accustomed to command, to being obeyed, to having his will unchallenged. Her father guided her forward, step by agonizing step, down the long, empty aisle. The silence of the room, once a distant hum, now felt absolute, broken only by the soft brush of her gown. Every single person present seemed to hold their breath, watching the bride and groom as they slowly, inevitably drew closer. Eleanor could taste the bitter irony of this moment, walking towards her captor, towards the man who held her father's life in his hands, disguised as a willing participant in a joyous union. His eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, remained locked on hers. They were windows into a depth she could not fathom, holding secrets she instinctively knew were dangerous. There was no recognition, no softness, no curiosity in their depths, only an unreadable, almost predatory awareness. He saw her, truly saw her, not just as a veiled figure, but as the woman forced into this union, the pawn in his family's game. The realization sent another wave of despair through her. A silent dialogue passed between them, a torrent of unspoken questions and accusations from her, met with an inscrutable, unwavering stare from him. His gaze held no kindness, no pity, only a quiet, absolute expectation. He did not blink, did not waver. It was a gaze that promised nothing, but demanded everything. This was the man to whom she was sacrificing her life, her future, her very soul. Julian Thorne's intense, unreadable gaze met Eleanor's. In a shiver, not of excitement but of dread, ran down her spine. The shiver spread, a cold current beneath Eleanor's heavy wedding gown. Her breath caught, a fragile thing threatened by the moment's enormity. The vast ballroom, glittering with crystal, seemed to tilt. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her, yet she saw only his. Julian Thorne, a dark silhouette against the distant altar, was a stark, undeniable force. Her bridesmaid, a woman she barely knew, nudged her arm. It was time. One foot in front of the other, the hollow instruction echoed for a journey she never wished to take. The heavy train brushed the marble, a soft whisper promising a gilded cage. Each step severed ties to her old life. Her heart thrummed, a frantic drumbeat of terror and resignation. The air, thick with lilies and perfume, felt suffocating. She traced the marble patterns with her mind, avoiding every gaze. Yet her eyes pulled to Julian, a magnet. He stood still, a statue carved from shadows, his expression unreadable. A faint aroma of aged wood and something sharp, masculine, reached her, an unwelcome sign of proximity. The guests' hushed murmurs amplified, distorting into 100 whispers, each judging this forced union. Eleanor felt disassociated, watching a play where she was the unwilling lead. Her lace-gloved fingers tightened on the bouquet, crushing petals. The scent of blossoms filled her nostrils, a sad offering to her dying hopes. She remembered her father's tear-filled eyes, his trembling hands signing the contract. This walk was for him, every painful inch. The weight of his debt, his despair, pressed on her, guiding her reluctant feet. She imagined him in the crowd, his face etched with guilt, unable to look at his daughter, the price of his mistakes. Sorrow washed over her, cold and sharp. The organ music, a grand, solemn melody, swelled, carrying her closer. It was beautiful, rich, but felt like a dirge, a farewell to her freedom. Her veil, a translucent barrier, softened the opulent room's edges, making it more unreal. The delicate lace tickled her cheeks, a phantom touch that made her want to tear it away, to breathe, to scream. As she drew nearer, Julian Thorne's face came into focus. The sharp jawline, dark, intense eyes, the solemn set of his mouth. He was handsome, sculpted from formidable will, but held no warmth, no joy. Only a quiet intensity, a predator's watchfulness. Her heart stumbled, then raced faster. Strength drained from her legs. How much further? The aisle stretched endlessly, paved with shattered dreams. Light from stained glass windows cast muted colors, painting the scene in solemn purple and deep gold. It was a grand spectacle, designed for celebration, but for Eleanor, an execution. Finally, she reached the altar. Julian stepped forward, his hand outstretched. His firm, clinical touch guided her beside him. His skin felt cool, a fleeting contact leaving a strange chill. She risked a glance at his profile. He did not look at her, facing the officiant, his gaze fixed. The officiant, a portly man with kind eyes, began to speak. His deep voice filled the space with formal words of union, commitment, of two souls becoming one. Eleanor heard them, but they bounced off her, hollow, meaningless. This was a charade, a performance for Victoria Thorne and her empire. Her mind sought refuge in memories. Her father's pipe tobacco, leaves rustling outside her window, charcoal dust on her fingertips, ghosts of her past, slipping away with each word. A profound, aching loss settled in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear off the veil and reveal the raw pain. She felt Julian's subtle shift, the quiet strength emanating from him. He was a wall, an impenetrable fortress. What was he thinking? Did he feel anything standing beside a stranger forced into his life? Or was he truly as detached, fulfilling another duty for his formidable family? The officiant continued, weaving tradition and expectation. He spoke of love, honor, and cherish. Each word was a tiny dagger twisting in Eleanor's heart. No love existed here, only a desperate bargain. No honor in her sacrifice, only crushing obligation. How could she cherish a man who destroyed her life? She stole another glance at Victoria Thorne in the front row. The matriarch's sharp blue eyes fixed on Eleanor, piercing her veil. A faint curve to Victoria's lips, a flicker of satisfaction. A look of triumph, confirmation of absolute power. Eleanor felt a surge of cold fury, quickly suppressed by helplessness. The ceremony felt endless, an agonizing stretch leading her closer to the point of no return. Vows, prayers, ancient rites blurred into an incomprehensible drone. She was a doll, moved by unseen hands. Her legs ached, shoulders heavy, head throbbing with a dull pulse. Then came the moment. The officiant paused, his gaze settling on Eleanor. "Eleanor Vance," he intoned, voice thick with tradition. "Do you take Julian Thorne to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Her breath hitched. The words hung heavy, binding. Her mind screamed protest. "No, I don't want this. I hate him. I hate what you've done to my life." Defiance raged, a tempest threatening to erupt. Heat rose in her cheeks, a tremor began in her hands. But she remembered her father's gaunt face, the worry etched around his eyes. Victoria Thorne's cold warning, the implied threats. His safety, his very life depended on this moment. She swallowed her protest, silencing the raging storm. The words were a bitter medicine. Her gaze flickered to Julian. He remained impassive, eyes fixed on the officiant. Yet she felt his strange awareness, a sense of being observed. Did he know her turmoil? Could he sense her utter repugnance? Or was he as unfeeling as he appeared? The silence stretched, thick, suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation. The officiant waited patiently, a gentle smile. Eleanor felt Victoria Thorne's unwavering stare, a silent command. The air crackled with anticipation, pressure building around her. Her throat felt dry, constricted. It took every ounce of will to force the sound. Her voice, a whisper, thin and reedy, almost lost. "I do," she managed. Two simple words, a betrayal of her soul. A cold, empty promise, devoid of sentiment, a lie for survival. A collective sigh rippled through the assembly. The officiant smiled, turning to Julian. "And Julian Thorne," he continued, his voice imbued with renewed purpose, "do you take Eleanor Vance to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Julian's response was immediate, crisp, resonant. "I do." His voice was deep, unwavering, carrying no hint of struggle. A statement of fact devoid of personal emotion as a legal clause. She felt a pang of resentment, fresh bitterness. He performed this role so easily, perfectly suited to this cold world. The officiant smiled warmly. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He gestured towards the rings, held on a velvet cushion by a young boy, a distant Thorne relative. The 8-year-old looked terrified, his small hands trembling. Julian took the first ring, a simple gold band for Eleanor. His fingers, long and slender, held clear strength. He turned to her. For the first time at the altar, his dark eyes met hers. No warmth, no tenderness, no acknowledgement, only that intense, unreadable gaze, a well of unspoken thoughts. Eleanor felt her blood run cold. She stood perfectly still, her hand hovering, waiting. The rich fabric of her dress felt like a shroud, heavy, suffocating. Air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a silent conversation. The ballroom, silent, seemed to hold its breath. He reached for her left hand. His touch was firm, cold, impersonal, yet a jolt. A strange electric current snaked up her arm. Her fingers locked around the bouquet, knuckles white. She looked down at their clasped hands, his pale skin against her gloved one, a stark contrast to their forced union. Julian slowly, deliberately, slid the plain gold band onto her finger. The metal felt cold, a chill seeping into her bones. It was a tangible mark of her captivity, a brand marking her as his property. The officiant's voice, a deep, resonant hum, cut through the quiet air of the Onyx Gallery ballroom. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute, echoing the finality Eleanor felt deep within her bones. A tremor ran through her despite her rigid posture. The crisp sound of the pronouncement struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the last vestiges of the girl she had been. She stood frozen, the silk of her gown a suffocating embrace, the scent of white roses cloying in her nostrils. Her heart, which had been a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, now seemed to skip, then plummet into a cold void. Husband and wife. The phrase was a foreign language, a cruel joke played on her very soul. It was a brand, etched not onto her skin, but directly into her future, sealing her fate with an invisible, unyielding mark. The weight of the ring on her finger, the cold metal that Julian Thorne had just placed there, suddenly felt like a shackle, binding her to a life she did not choose, to a man she did not know, and to a family that felt like a predatory beast. A soft ripple went through the assembled guests, a faint collective sway of expectation, a shift in posture, a subtle rustle of expensive fabrics. They were waiting. Eleanor knew what they were waiting for. The traditional expected culmination of such a ceremony. The kiss. Her stomach churned, a bitter bile rising in her throat. She imagined the cold press of his lips, a final violation, an acknowledgement of his ownership. No, not this. She would not allow even this small ceremonial surrender. Her mind, usually so pliant, so fearful, suddenly solidified into an unyielding block of defiance. Julian Thorne turned then, his movement fluid and unhurried. He was closer now, his tall frame looming beside her, the dark fabric of his suit a stark contrast to her virginal white. The air between them, already thick with unspoken tension, seemed to vibrate. Eleanor could hear the subtle creak of his shoes on the polished marble floor, the faint scent of his cologne, sharp and unfamiliar, filling the space around her. She did not raise her head, keeping her gaze fixed on the intricate embroidery of her gown, counting each stitch, each tiny pearl, as if her life depended on it. She felt his presence, a tangible force, even without looking. His shadow, long and dark, fell across her, engulfing her in its chill. Her breath hitched. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment she was expected to yield, to play the part of the demure, grateful bride. Her fingers locked around the delicate bouquet, the thorns of the rose stems pricking her skin, a small, welcome pain. It was a reminder that she was still capable of feeling, still alive, still her own person, even amidst this suffocating charade. A flicker of movement caught her periphery. Julian Thorne was closer still. She felt the subtle shift in the air pressure as he leaned in, the faint brush of cloth against her veil. Her breath caught in her throat. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her, her vision blurred at the edges, the crystal chandeliers above suddenly too bright, too numerous. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle energy of his impending action. Every instinct screamed at her to recoil, to shrink away, to disappear. But then a different emotion surged, hot and fierce, through her veins. It was a raw, untamed fury, born of desperation and injustice. It was the culmination of weeks of dread, the betrayal of her father, the icy pronouncements of Victoria Thorne, the cold, hard reality of her lost freedom. This was not a surrender. This was a battleground, and she would not be taken captive without a fight. Even if her weapon was only a look, it would be a look that burned. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor lifted her head. Her hazel eyes, usually soft and shadowed with sorrow, now blazed with a fierce, unwavering light. She met Julian Thorne's gaze head-on, pouring every ounce of her anguish, her resentment, her absolute loathing into that single searing stare. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a desolate, unyielding hatred that promised an endless, silent war. It was a promise whispered not with words, but with the full force of her betrayed soul. She saw him, truly saw him for the first time, not as a stranger, but as the architect of her despair, the unwitting recipient of her sacrificial rage. His dark eyes, which had seemed so unreadable moments before, now held a hint of something complex, something almost guarded. His jaw was sharp, his expression perpetually serious, but in the depths of his gaze, she thought she saw a flicker, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. It was a recognition, a spark of understanding, perhaps even surprise, at the raw, untamed emotion she projected. Her gaze was a physical assault, a silent scream of defiance aimed directly at his unyielding facade. She wanted him to feel the weight of her sacrifice, the enormity of what had been stolen from her. She wanted him to understand that this marriage, this life, would be no simple arrangement. It would be a constant, simmering conflict, a quiet rebellion waged in the confines of their shared existence. Every memory of her father's tears, every moment of Victoria Thorne's chilling threats, every stolen dream of her own future, coalesced into the venom in her eyes. Julian Thorne did not flinch. His expression remained mostly impassive, a mask of aristocratic control. Yet that subtle flicker in his dark eyes lingered, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. It was not a reaction of anger or offense, but something deeper, more analytical. He saw the fire in her, the absolute refusal to bend, and he did not dismiss it. Instead, he seemed to absorb it, to process it. A strange, knowing glint entered his gaze, as if he had just been given a piece of information he had been seeking. The air around them thickened, charged with a silent current of raw emotion. It was as if the entire opulent ballroom, filled with hundreds of well-dressed guests, had momentarily faded into the background. There was only Eleanor, Julian, and the unspoken challenge that hung between them, more potent than any spoken vow. Her heart pounded now, not with fear, but with a fierce, almost exhilarating sense of having finally asserted herself, even in this small, desperate way. She had drawn a line, and she had done it with only her eyes. He did not attempt to kiss her. The moment stretched, elongated, charged with the palpable tension of their silent confrontation. The guests, who had leaned forward in anticipation, now seemed to hold their breath, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, though perhaps not understanding its depth. A few whispers began to ripple through the crowd, soft inquiries, puzzled glances exchanged between families. Victoria Thorne, from her front row seat, remained perfectly still, her sharp eyes fixed on her son and his new bride, her expression unreadable. Eleanor felt a cold satisfaction bloom in her chest. She had denied him the symbolic act of possession, the public display of marital intimacy. She had made it clear, without uttering a single word, that she was not a prize, not a docile lamb led to slaughter. She was a force, however small, however trapped, that would not be easily tamed. Her gaze, still locked with his, was a silent vow of resistance, a promise that this union would be anything but peaceful. Julian Thorne slowly straightened, the subtle lean dissipating. He did not break eye contact immediately. Instead, his gaze held hers for another long, deliberate moment, an unspoken conversation passing between them. There was no warmth, no tenderness, no hint of the bond expected on a wedding day, only a profound, chilling understanding. He had seen her defiance, and he had accepted the gauntlet she threw. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his lips, not a smile of amusement, but something far more complex, perhaps even a hint of grim acknowledgement. It was a silent acceptance of the war she had just declared. He had looked into her soul, saw the depth of her pain and her refusal to surrender, and he had met it with his own enigmatic resolve. The officiant cleared his throat softly, a gentle reminder that the ceremony was not yet entirely concluded. The spell was broken, the intense connection between them fractured by the external world. Julian Thorne finally averted his gaze, turning his attention to the officiant, his face once again a mask of cool detachment. Eleanor felt a strange lightness, a sense of having passed a crucial test, even as the cold dread of her new reality settled back over her. The air crackled with unspoken animosity between them, a declaration of war silently exchanged in front of hundreds of unwitting guests. The air in the Onyx Gallery ballroom felt heavy. A silent, chilling message passed between Eleanor and Julian. Guests surged forward, oblivious, a tide of opulence with forced smiles and cold pleasantries. Eleanor felt like an object, a display piece. Her white gown, a dream she never wanted, now felt like a tomami. Movement was stiff, constrained by fabric and expectation. Her bouquet felt fragile in her hand, wilting under scrutiny. Eyes dissected her, judging the new Thorne wife. A shiver traced her spine from raw exposure. Victoria Thorne was at her side quickly, her voice a low hum. "Smile, Eleanor," she instructed, her firm grip on Eleanor's arm. "You are a Thorne now. Act like it." The words branded her, the name tasting like ash. She curved her lips, a mechanical alien gesture that drained her. Perfumes mingled with food and champagne, creating a dizzying haze. Waiters offered flutes of amber liquid. Eleanor accepted one, the cold glass a comfort against trembling fingers. Bubbles tickled her tongue, but the taste was flat. Every interaction felt like an interview, a constant test. She offered polite, non-committal answers about her past and future. Each question probed, each answer a lie to guard her privacy. She saw Julian Thorne across the room, tall and unapproachable, a dark silhouette. He was surrounded by grim men, their talk far from the polite chatter. He never looked her way. The altar's silent animosity persisted, a tangible barrier. His wife, yet she was an island, alone in a sea of strangers. This isolating solitude was her new reality. Hours blurred, marked by shifting light and music. Eleanor's head began to pound, an ache behind her eyes and in her chest. Her feet, in unforgiving heels, protested. She longed for her old home, its quiet sanctuary, the smell of tea and books. That life felt like a distant dream. She was here now in this gilded cage, performing an unchosen role. The watchful Victoria Thorne gestured for Eleanor to greet guests, to play her part. Each command was subtle, predatory, and absolute. She was a puppet, dancing for an indifferent audience. Her inner world, once vibrant with artistic dreams, now felt desolate. The girl who sketched, who found beauty, was lost, swallowed by Blackwood Manor's cold grandeur. A hush fell as Julian Thorne, escorted by Victoria, moved to an elevated platform. Music softened, all eyes turned to him. Eleanor's breath caught. This was the groom's speech, traditional words of gratitude. A phantom hope flickered in her chest for some human acknowledgement of their union. She quickly suppressed it. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. Julian Thorne stood rigid before the microphone, scanning the crowd with dismissive eyes. He looked detached, performing a task. His low, measured voice held authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone devoid of warmth, "thank you for joining us today." His gaze swept over guests, bypassing Eleanor. Her heart gave a painful thud. He spoke briefly of the union of two families, a business transaction. No mention of love, no shared future, no personal touch. It was a sterile address, a strategic alliance. He did not mention Eleanor. No loving glance, no shared anecdote. Humiliation burned her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral, an indifferent mask. She expected this, yet the reality stung. "My mother and I appreciate your presence," he continued, his voice unwavering. "May this alliance be prosperous for all involved." The words hung cold, a public affirmation of their transaction. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of conclusion, then stepped back. The applause was polite, scattered, fading into murmurs. He had delivered his part, fulfilled his obligation, retreating into his stoic shell. Eleanor watched him return to his serious men, the distance vast. His speech was a stark reminder of her place, a component in Thorne machinery. She was a means to an end, a contract signature. Any faint hope of unrevealed depth was extinguished. He was as cold and unfeeling as the manor itself. As the evening wore on, the reception shifted from forced formality to subdued conviviality. Exhausted, Eleanor wished the earth would swallow her. Minutes felt like hours, conversations a performance she could not maintain. Her head swam with cloying flowers, gown weight, and meaningless chatter. She wanted it to end. Finally, Victoria Thorne gave a subtle nod. An aide approached Eleanor. "Mrs. Thorne," the woman said softly, "it is time." Relief almost buckled Eleanor's knees. She was led away from the dying party, through dim corridors, up a grand staircase into Blackwood Manor's shadowed upper floors. Silence grew with each step, reception sounds fading to a hum. The heavy, ornate door revealed an opulent bedroom. It was vast, larger than her childhood home with dark, heavy furniture carved from rich woods. Midnight silken drapes blocked the fading day from tall windows. A massive four-poster bed, draped in brocade, piled with plush pillows, dominated the room. An antique crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, casting soft light that barely pierced the gloom. "This will be your room, Mrs. Thorne," the aide announced, her voice echoing. "Use the intercom by the bed if you require anything." She spoke with practiced formality, avoiding Eleanor's eyes. No warmth, no comfort. A transaction, a duty performed. Eleanor nodded, mute. Her throat felt tight. The aide, sensing silence, curtsied and withdrew, closing the heavy door with a decisive click. The sound sealed Eleanor inside. She was utterly alone. The silence was deafening, a palpable weight. Not the comforting quiet of her old room, but a deep, oppressive silence that swallowed sound. She heard her own frantic heart, the rustle of her dress, the tremor in her hands. The room's grandeur, meant to impress, felt suffocating. Dark, polished wood gleamed menacingly. Heavy fabrics absorbed warmth, leaving the air cool and sterile. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum. She scanned unfamiliar objects, priceless antiques, cold landscapes. None offered solace. No personal touch, just a sterile display of wealth and power. Eleanor walked slowly to the window, silk-clad feet sinking into plush carpet. She pulled back a drape, revealing a sliver of outside world. Beyond the glass, Blackwood Manor's foreboding woods loomed, dark under pale moonlight. It felt like a prison wall, sealing her off. She imagined her father awake in his home, worrying. Sorrow washed over her, stinging her eyes. She had done this for his safety, but at what cost? The gown's weight felt unbearable, a reminder of the vows, the man. She longed to tear it off, to shed this costume. Her fingers fumbled with delicate buttons, impossibly intricate. Her reflection caught her eye in an ornate mirror. She walked towards it, slow and deliberate, as if to a stranger. The mirror reflected her, a figure in white, auburn hair arranged, face pale beneath makeup. She saw the heavy fabric, shimmering lace, sparkling jewels. But beneath the opulence, she saw something else. Her eyes, once bright with quiet dreams, now held a haunted, defeated look. Her lips, a ghost of the forced smile, trembled slightly. The artist she had been, who found comfort in charcoal, was gone. In her place stood this woman, adorned in finery, stripped bare. She was a captive, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her future lay before her like an unwritten page, stark and terrifying. Morning light filtered through the heavy silk drapes in Eleanor's vast bedroom, painting the ornate carpet in muted gold. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and something vaguely floral, a constant reminder that this was not her home. Each breath was a conscious effort, a quiet rebellion against the manor's suffocating silence, against the life she now found herself trapped within. She rose, feeling the polished floors chill beneath her bare feet, a stark contrast to the worn rugs of her childhood room. Her heart still carried the ghost of the previous night's humiliation. A phantom ache came from the cold ring on her finger, a symbol of the silent war declared. Victoria Thorne, a figure of formidable elegance, ensured Eleanor understood her place. Breakfasts were a silent ordeal in the cavernous dining hall. the clinking of silver on porcelain echoing through the space. Victoria's gaze, sharp and unwavering, followed Eleanor's every move. It dissected her posture, her choice of food, even her teacup grip. Eleanor learned to keep her eyes down, her answers brief, her emotions carefully hidden. The matriarch spoke of expectations, of duties, of the Thorn legacy that now rested heavily on Eleanor's shoulders. Each word was a silken cord, tightening around Eleanor's throat, reminding her that she was merely a vessel for their will. She tasted the bitter tang of resentment with her morning coffee, feeling the enormous crystal chandelier above her, poised to fall. Days blurred into imposed routines and lonely hours. Eleanor spent much of her time wandering the endless corridors of the manor, a silent ghost in a gilded cage. She sought out forgotten corners, places where the air felt less charged with the Thorn presence, places where she might briefly remember herself. The grand halls with their dark tapestries and ancestral portraits felt like a cold, uninviting museum. She pressed her hand against the smooth, cold stone of the walls. She felt the vastness of the place, the deep roots of its history, and her own crushing insignificance within it. Julian Thorne was a fleeting presence, appearing and disappearing like a shadow. Their interactions were stark, brief encounters in hallways or at formal dinners. He spoke few words, his voice a low rumble that rarely betrayed emotion. One afternoon, she saw him in the massive library, books stretching to the high ceiling. He stood by a tall window, the late afternoon sun illuminating dust motes dancing around his dark silhouette. His gaze was fixed on a leather-bound book. As she passed the open doorway, he looked up. "Are you lost, Eleanor?" he asked. His voice was even, devoid of warmth, yet a tremor ran through her. She shook her head, clutching the folds of her dress. "No, Julian, just exploring." He offered a curt nod, returning to his book, dismissing her as quickly as he had acknowledged her. This fleeting, detached acknowledgement was common. Yet in that brief exchange, she thought she saw a flicker behind his eyes, a depth contradicting his cold exterior. It was gone too quickly to decipher, leaving her with a strange, unsettling curiosity. She found herself wondering what stories lay hidden behind that stoic facade. Another day, she encountered him in the main foyer. She was descending the sweeping staircase, her hand gliding along the cool mahogany banister. He entered through the heavy oak doors, followed by two stern-faced men. The scent of rain and damp earth clung to his expensive suit. He glanced up as she reached the bottom step. "Your father called," he stated, his voice flat. "He is well." Mother spoke with him. Eleanor's heart leaped, a sudden surge of relief and longing. She had not been allowed to speak to Arthur since the wedding. She wanted to ask more, to hear his voice, to know he was truly safe. But the words caught in her throat. Julian offered no further details, simply turning and walking away, leaving her standing alone in the vast hall, the silence pressing in. A wave of frustration washed over her. She had a desperate craving for even a crumb of information about the man she had sacrificed everything for. She clenched her fists, wishing she could scream at him, demand answers, but she knew it would be futile. His gaze had held a strange, distant quality, as if he were delivering a message he found utterly trivial. Her resentment for Julian remained a burning ember, stoked by every dismissive glance, every cold word. He was the embodiment of her captivity, the face of the family that had stolen her life. Yet a sliver of intrigue began to bloom in the barren landscape of her despair. She watched him from afar sometimes, catching glimpses of him in the garden, speaking quietly with staff. He would also stride purposefully through the manor. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority. Yet a certain weariness, a subtle burden, sometimes seemed to weigh his shoulders. It was a contradiction she could not reconcile, and it bothered her. This unsettled the neat narrative she had constructed of him as a purely cruel and unfeeling man. One afternoon, seeking refuge from Victoria's latest lecture on acceptable decorum, Eleanor found herself in a lesser-used wing of the manor. The air here was cooler, dustier, carrying the faint smell of forgotten things. She pushed open a heavy, unadorned door, expecting to find a storage room or another unused parlor. Instead, she stepped into a room bathed in a soft, ethereal light from a large skylight. It was a study, but unlike the formal, imposing library, this room felt lived in, intensely personal. Shelves lined the walls, not with ancient tomes of law or finance. Instead, they held books on art history, philosophy, and classical literature. Some were well worn, their spines creased, pages marked with faint pencil lines. A large wooden desk dominated the center of the room. It was covered with scattered papers, fountain pens, and a half-finished sketch. The sketch looked remarkably like a landscape from her own sketchbook. Her breath hitched. She recognized the style, the delicate yet firm lines, the way the light was captured. It was Julian's. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a small, intricately carved wooden bird from the desk, feeling the smooth, cool wood. This was not the cold, calculating Julian she knew. This was a glimpse into a hidden world, a quieter, more thoughtful man. A faint scent of pipe tobacco lingered in the air, mixed with old paper and something vaguely earthy. She ran her hand over the spines of the books, feeling a connection to this unknown Julian. He was a man who read the same poets she did, who saw the world with an artist's eye. It was disconcerting, unsettling her carefully constructed image of him. She moved deeper into the room, drawn by a small, discreet cabinet tucked away in a shadowed corner. On its polished surface sat a single frame photograph. It was old, the silver frame slightly tarnished, the image faded with time. Eleanor reached for it, her fingers hovering, a strange mix of apprehension and irresistible curiosity compelling her. She wanted to know more, to understand the complexities that lay beneath the rigid mask. She yearned for a moment of genuine human connection, even if it was just with a ghost from his past. Her fingers brushed against the cool glass of the frame, just as a low voice, heavy with unexpected presence, cut through the quiet. "What are you doing in here, Eleanor?" Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, a sickening lurch that sent a jolt of fear through her. She spun around, her hands still frozen mid-air above the photograph. Julian stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, casting a long shadow into the room. His intense dark eyes were fixed on her. They were no longer unreadable, but hard, cold, and utterly devoid of any of the subtle weariness she had sometimes observed. The air crackled between them, thick with accusation and a silent, unmistakable warning. His gaze stripped away her fleeting curiosity, leaving only the stark reality of her trespass. Eleanor still felt the phantom chill of Julian's gaze, a silent accusation that echoed through the empty study. The faded photograph, clutched moments before, burned in her memory. His dark, sharp eyes spoke without words. This was his territory, his sanctuary. She was an intruder, a pawn. Yet a quiet resolve settled deep in her bones, not reckless defiance, but a knowing calm. Open rebellion would only crush her. Her path must be a winding labyrinth of subtle choices. The days became a careful dance. Victoria Thorne, ever watchful, dictated Eleanor's new life, from breakfast time to the silk she wore. Eleanor listened, her head tilted in deference, her voice soft in agreement. Then a quiet suggestion would emerge. A different book, a subtle rearrangement of flowers, a slight menu alteration. These were not direct challenges, but small assertions of self within Blackwood Manor's suffocating grandeur. One afternoon, Victoria meticulously planned a charity gala seating. She laid place cards with surgical precision, explaining each guest's social hierarchy. Eleanor stood beside her, observing the calligraphy in the drawing room's heavy silence. Old paper and Victoria's sharp perfume filled the air. Eleanor's fingers traced a cool marble bust, a goddess with an unyielding face. "Perhaps," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "if Mrs. Harrington were placed next to Mr. Davies, it might facilitate their new business venture. I heard of it at the luncheon last week." Victoria paused, her thin lips pressing into a line. Her piercing blue eyes sharpened on Eleanor. A distant clock chimed. Eleanor felt a tremor, fearing she had overstepped, yet she held Victoria's gaze. The older woman slowly picked up 2 place cards. "An interesting observation, Eleanor," Victoria stated, her tone neutral. She moved the cards, a tiny shift in her grand design. "Perhaps you are right." Eleanor suppressed a sigh of relief. It was a small, almost invisible victory, yet it felt like fresh air in the Manor's heavy atmosphere. She watched Victoria, a woman who controlled her world, concede one detail. This was the way, Eleanor realized. to chip away at the gilded cage. She could not break the bars, but she might bend them with her mind. Julian, a silent, brooding presence, began to notice. He observed Eleanor across the dining table, watching her subtle head tilts, the thoughtful pauses before she spoke. He remembered the fierce, hateful gaze at their wedding, the raw defiance in her hazel eyes. Now that defiance was cloaked, refined, wielded with unexpected intelligence. One evening, Eleanor reviewed household accounts. Victoria used these ledgers to keep Eleanor under her thumb. A thick, leather-bound book lay open on the mahogany desk. Its pages smelled of dust and old paper. A single lamp cast long shadows. Eleanor found a discrepancy, a recurring overcharge from a long-standing vendor. She highlighted it with a faint pencil mark, a tiny rebellion. Julian entered, a book in hand. He walked to a far shelf, pulled out a volume, and settled into an armchair near the crackling fireplace. Aged leather and wood smoke filled the air. Eleanor felt his gaze, a weight on her shoulders, but she did not look up. She continued her work, her pen scratching softly. She felt the warmth from the fireplace, a sharp contrast to the room's coolness. After a long silence, Julian's low voice cut through the quiet. "You found something." Eleanor slowly raised her head. His eyes were unreadable, but held a flicker of curiosity. "A small inconsistency," she replied, her voice calm. "A vendor charging a premium for services that could be acquired elsewhere for less. It is substantial over time." Julian closed his book. "Victoria is loyal to her suppliers." His tone held a hint of sarcasm. "Loyalty is commendable," Eleanor agreed, her fingers on the ledger. "But efficiency is important in business, is it not?" He said nothing, simply studying her. Eleanor felt a strange fluttering in her chest, not fear, but a nascent excitement. A thrill of being seen, understood, perhaps acknowledged. The air crackled with unspoken thoughts, a tension different from hostility. Julian rose, walked past the desk, and left without another word. Eleanor stared at the empty doorway, a mix of triumph and confusion swirling within her. The true test, the next escalation in this silent war, arrived with the family dinner. Victoria hosted these weekly gatherings with meticulous formality, a display of power. The grand dining room glittered under chandeliers. The scent of roasted lamb and expensive wine hung heavy. Eleanor wore a deep emerald gown, chosen by Victoria, but had changed the antique brooch from a thorn crest to a simple silver leaf. Victoria sat at the head of the long table, her silver hair pulled back severely, her eyes sweeping over everyone. Julian sat opposite Eleanor, his face a mask of indifference. Other family members murmured polite conversation, wary of Victoria's presence. Eleanor felt Victoria's scrutiny, a palpable pressure that made the food taste bland. Conversation turned to a land acquisition the Thorne family intended to develop. Victoria spoke of it with relish, and soon she announced, "The last few holdouts will understand the futility of their resistance. Progress always wins." Eleanor's hand tightened around her wine glass. She knew the land, a historic neighborhood with a community garden, a place of quiet beauty. Her father had spoken of it with fondness. A burning in her chest flared, a fierce protectiveness. Direct defiance was suicide, but her intelligence offered a different weapon. "It is a beautiful area," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden lull. Dolph's eyes turned to her. Victoria's gaze was a cold blade. "I recall the old oak tree there, the one with the swing, a landmark, many would say." She paused, sipping wine. "Perhaps," she continued, choosing words with precision, "a public relations challenge, to remove something so beloved by the community. It might prove more costly than its acquisition in the long run. Public sentiment can be unpredictable." A hush fell over the table. Victoria's expression remained unreadable, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. The air grew heavy. Eleanor's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs, but she held her ground. She met Victoria's stare, not with anger, but with calm, analytical assessment. She was presenting a strategic consideration. Eleanor then turned her head, her eyes meeting Julian's. He had been watching her. His posture was rigid, his fork untouched. His dark eyes, usually guarded, held a complex depth. In that brief, silent exchange, there was no hatred. Instead, Eleanor saw challenge, an acknowledgement of her audacity. Beneath it, she sensed understanding, a recognition of her strategic mind, and a flicker of grudging respect. Julian's eyes held hers for a beat, a silent conversation across the polished mahogany. She saw her own defiance reflected in his dark depths, a mutual recognition of the game. She felt a strange warmth, a connection forged in the white-hot intensity of their shared predicament, their dance around Victoria's power. Victoria finally broke the silence, her voice sharp. "We will consider your insights, Eleanor, thank you." Her tone was icy polite, a clear warning. But the seeds were sown. Eleanor had spoken, and Julian had witnessed it, acknowledged it. Later that night, alone in her opulent chamber, Eleanor stood by the tall window. She looked out at the ancient, foreboding woods surrounding Blackwood Manor. The thin crescent moon cast long, spectral shadows. She still felt Julian's lingering gaze, a warmth that had nothing to do with hatred. The war for her freedom had begun. Her battle was now intertwined with Julian's, a complex, unpredictable path within Blackwood Manor's gilded cage. A new future awaited them both, its contours vague, no longer solitary.